um, voice of resilience, and a beacon of cultural introspection. Ms. Darabanga has become Africa's most influential authors. Nervous Conditions was the first novel published in English by a Black Zimbabwean woman and won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. It is celebrated as one of BBC's 100 stories that shaped the world. Beyond literature, Ms. Darabanga is an acclaimed filmmaker, dedicated activist, championing African stories and social justice through her work. Today, I have the privilege of delving into a mind of a visionary whose narratives have reshaped our understanding of identity and resilience. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Tsitsi Dangarembga to stage. Mr. Dangarembga, thank you for joining us today. Your works have touched on many profound themes, such as um, color, culture, change, and equality. And that's exactly what our conversation will surround. Because today we're celebrating Juneteenth, everyone. And also, by the way, how's your cat? By the way, how's your cat Minka, who has inspired you so much?
Thank you so much. Is it on? No, let me try this one.
But we can share. It's all.
Oh, okay, there we go. Yes, hello everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much, Surupa, for inviting me, and thank you so much, Aayati, for that lovely introduction. Unfortunately, my cat Minka passed away. Yes,
Sorry to
yes.
hear that.
But she's remembered. You mentioned her name now, and yes, she was an inspiration.
So, what first really inspired you to become a writer? And can you share some of your earliest literary influences and how they shaped your voice? Because your writing is very inspiring and it has given me a voice that I would never have discovered if I didn't read your book. So, I want to know how this journey really got started.
Yes, well, Ayati, I grew up in Rhodesia, which was Zimbabwe before independence. It was a British colony. I grew up in the 1960s. And I remember reading a lot, but I never read about girls like myself, families like my own, people like me. So when I became a young woman, I simply thought to myself, well, if I didn't have any stories about people like me, that probably means that other young women now don't have those stories. And since I like writing, let me start writing the stories. It really was that simple. So it was trying to plug a gap, trying to make good a lack. That's really what my inspiration was. So I started writing seriously in the 1980s. And this was the time when the African American and African Caribbean women writers like Paul Marshall, Toni Morrison, and so forth were becoming famous. And they were so famous that I was able to get hold of their literature in Zimbabwe. The country was now Zimbabwe. And so they inspired me. It made me think, yes, it can be done. Okay, these are stories about diasporic African women, but I can also start writing about the local African women in Zimbabwe.
Wow, that's really inspiring. And you develop so many complex and dynamic characters that have so many nuances. And I remember in Nervous Conditions, one of your character emphasizes the importance of having conviction, not being anyone's underdog. So, can you discuss a time where you had to do that yourself and stand by your convictions despite societal or family pressures?
Right. Well, the latest instance of that was in 2020. And it was a time of change in Zimbabwe. It's always a time of change in Zimbabwe, but it was particularly present at that time. And some people were agitating for citizen activism to induce further change in the government, and they called for a demonstration. So I was very vocal on social media supporting this call for a demonstration. And then a few days before the demonstration, I heard that the demonstration had been forbidden by the government. It was just, I think, some kind of pronouncement was made that you shall not demonstrate, and people were expected to obey that and simply not go out on the street. So I had to ask myself what I should do. And I thought to myself, it would be very difficult for me not to go out on this demonstration because I had been vocal. I had encouraged other people to go out and demonstrate peacefully because that means of communicating with government is constitutional in Zimbabwe. We have the right to demonstrate peacefully. And so I felt it would not be a very good example if I did not go. So I decided I was going to go anyway. I remember driving to a location where I was to meet a friend so we could demonstrate together, and the streets were quiet. It was not just people not walking, but there were almost no cars. Everybody seemed to have obeyed this command not to go out onto the streets. And I can remember my stomach felt really tight, and I was thinking, shall I turn back? And I thought to myself, no, I can't. I have to stand up for what I believe in. We cannot simply have our rights eroded in that manner. So I met my friend and we started going down the road. We had posters calling for press freedom and better conditions and more accountability on the part of government. And I remember standing at an intersection and I saw a riot vehicle going down the road. And I thought to myself very uncharitably, I hope it is going to keep going and not turn. I hope it's going to go and pick up other people and not me. So out of the corner of my eye, I saw it indicating, I saw it turn to come down to where my friend and I were. And I knew that, okay, this is not going to end well. And it didn't. It ended in a 3-year court case. But at least I wasn't thrown into prison. So that was the last time that I had to really stand up for my convictions.
That is such a powerful way of standing up for who you are and what you believe in. And talking about belief and relationships, also nervous conditions, you discuss a very interesting topic: coexisting in peaceful detachment, whether it be with the government or whether it be in family. I think you say it so beautifully in your book. How do you interpret the balance between detachment and connection in family relationships, especially in patriarchal settings?
That's a really important point that you pick up there. And I think it's a very important point for women because often women can move from detachment into subservience. And it's very difficult to remember who you are. And there's always this pressure that as the woman, you have to be the peacemaker. You cannot escalate. Your role is to de escalate, it is to contain tension. But what people don't realize is that when a woman is enacting that role, something is happening inside her. And often this can result in detachment from the self because you're taking in all this negativity. You're not able to process it as you need to for your own good. And so one tends to split off from that. So it is a really difficult process. And I think that for me, my writing is part of my negotiating that complex. Um, I also think that age helps with experience. One gets to the point where one understands what one believes in, but is better able to harness the skills that one has in order to engage in a positive manner that generates positive energy rather than negative energy.
And you are so powerfully just saying everything. It's absolutely amazing. And talking about having a even if they have a space to grow out of, right? Um, According to Save the Children, more than 50 million children are displaced worldwide due to war and climate change, a record number that has doubled since 2010. And you discuss the theme of leaving, right? and, like as you said, split off, right? You discussed the theme of leaving versus being taken places and how these experiences affect one's sense of identity. So how do you think these affect one's sense of identity?
I think that not having a place that one can identify with, that one belongs to, where one feels the same as other people, is a traumatizing situation for young people. But I do think that it is happening more and more. As you say, the numbers of displaced children has doubled since 2010. So I think that people are becoming more mobile in the world for one reason or another. It could be through choice, or it could be as a result of being displaced or feeling that one has to leave home in order for economic prospects, which is a situation we have in Zimbabwe at the moment. Zimbabwe currently has one of the fastest growing African diasporas because of the negative political and economic situation in the country. So I think that being a mobile person, somebody who moves from place to place, is not as much of a stigma in itself as it used to be. However, there is the problem that the mobility of some people from some parts of the world results in pushback from the people who live in the countries to which people emigrate. So we see the escalating tensions. Now, we saw them in the United States in the past decade. We've just had the European elections here in Europe, and there is a definite shift to the right, which in part is fueled by people imagining that people who migrate are causing problems in the countries. So I think there is some give and take. While the community of people who are mobile is growing, that growth is also resulting in pushback. It's a very complex situation. But I think that people have always moved. Even when we did not have the means of transport that we have today, people used to trek from continent to continent, even. So people have always been mobile. And in fact, the fact that sit here and talk about my history as somebody who was in a British colony means the British had moved down to southern Africa. So it's something that happens to people. And I think that it's great that we now have the opportunities to talk. We have the internet, we have so many resources where we can engage about these things and share experiences.
And you are talking about all of these things about home, right? Family relationships. And you also talk about the novel has a lot of symbolism and metaphors, right? Such as Naisha's eating disorder. Naisha is one of the main characters if you don't know about her. Can you, and if you want to read Nervous Conditions, it's one of the best books. I recommend it. Can you elaborate on some of these symbols and their significance in the story and the impact on society?
What was really important for me in Nervous Conditions was to talk about the subjectivity, the actual being human of a group of people who had never been considered in literature before. And so this was young Black Zimbabwean girls and women. And to tell that story, I realized that I had to have characters who were at the extremes. So Tambudzai, who is the narrator, wants to be educated, and she does everything in her power to be educated. It's not normal for a young Zimbabwean girl to fight so hard for her education. But I wanted to tell other young Zimbabwean girls that you need to develop the capacity to fight for the things that you want in life. And not only that, you need to allow yourself to want things in life. It's an act of courage to actually stand up and declare, I want this. Because generally, as female people, we are not encouraged to really engage with our own wants. And so, how much more a young, poor girl, a Black girl in Zimbabwe? So, that was number one. So now Nyasha was not in the same situation as Tambudzai. She was not impoverished, and her parents believed in education. But that education comes with a price. It is a kind of movement. It's a kind of intellectual and psychological movement. So you lose the home that is where most people are impoverished in the rural areas. So again, she's an outsider. And she had been to England also. And I needed a metaphor to show how extreme this being outside was. Now, I studied psychology, and one of the issues there was that for a long time it was believed that Black people did not suffer from depression. It was in the literature, you could read it. And I can remember reading an article where it said that rather than becoming depressed, Black people in Zimbabwe had what they called brief reacted psychosis. And this was an attack of schizophrenic like symptoms that lasted about 3 months. And then the people were meant to get better. And so there was not really a concept. I think this paper was from the 1940s, so it was really old. But it just shows that that's how people thought. So it was important for me to address the fact that this is not true. How depression manifests really depends on what people are able to do. So now think about it. If you are a person in a rural area, a reservation where there is absolutely nothing, no prospects, what you do in the morning is you get up and you go to your field and you cook maize meal. It's a kind of polenta called sadza. You cook that and you have it with vegetables, and then you go to bed, and tomorrow is the same. How are your symptoms of depression going to manifest? So it was important for me to have a character whose symptoms could manifest in a way that we could see so that the conversation could begin. So I wrote Nervous Conditions in the 1980s. And now in Zimbabwe, we have a huge problem of depression and other mental illness amongst young people, and they find that they have neglected this area. So we don't even have treatment available for these young people. What has actually happened is that an enterprising psychologist has developed what he calls a friendship bench. And he has taken the figure in the community who is a kind of comforting maternal figure, and this is a grandmother. You know, there's a grandmother in nervous conditions also who is that kind of figure. And this is because in our communities, and probably in many other communities, this is a generic figure of comfort and wisdom. And so he has taken these people from the communities, gives them basic counseling training, and then literally puts them on benches in places that are accessible and people can come and talk to them. And I look at this and I find it really distressing because 1980, studying psychology, I had already begun to point out this problem. And here we are, 2020, and we're just beginning to grapple with it.
And talking about characters that, and even in real life, Zimbabwe is a place where there is not so much access to all these stuff that young people now need. There's no more of awareness, right? But in also talking about awareness, Naisha, whose father is Baba Mukru, who has a lot of status in society, he uses the term whoredom, which is used to condemn Naisha. So how do such words reflect societal attitudes towards girls and women?
Yes, Nyasha's father, Babamkuru, does condemn her to whoredom. That's the word that I use in the book. Um, and really, I'm talking about the patriarchal nature of Zimbabwean society. And we have a very complex kind of patriarchy in Zimbabwe because we have a traditional patriarchy, which definitely was patriarchy, but it was not a patriarchy that is invested in capital. The moment you bring in patriarchy that is invested in capital, you have a change in the relationships. So, in the traditional patriarchy, women had their own status. A woman who was born into a particular nuclear family would get married and become what we call a murora in her husband's family. And there she had no status. But as she became older in her own family, she gained status as a kind of a matriarch. So while there was no status in the family that you're married into, you had increasing status in your own family. And this was shown in the fact that women were allowed to own certain kinds of property and to pass these kinds of property on to their daughters. Enter capitalism, everything changed. Women were said to be perpetual minors. They could never achieve the age of majority. This happened in 1982 after independence. So things like driving a car, you had to have a male person from your family who would sign the papers for you to be able to get your license, etc., etc. So Zimbabwe's patriarchy is really quite toxic because it is so complex, and because it's this mixture of two different kinds of patriarchy, it can be manipulated. That sometimes people think, will say, okay, in tradition we do it like this in a way that is negative to women, or then they will say, okay, but the law says women cannot do this and cannot do that, even though we have the age of majority. So now they're using the laws that came in with colonization. It's still a fight. It's still a fight. The constitution in Zimbabwe gives women equality, but the ingrained ideas that people have are really more difficult to change.
You define status in a very um, interesting way. So, can you discuss the connections between gender, power, and respect in families and society, and how that gives into status as well?
I was really interested in the lives of young girls because being female, being black, they did not have much status. They were like at the bottom of the pile. And I asked myself the question, how can girls, people in this condition, develop into adults who can self actualize, who can achieve their goals, who can allow themselves to have ambitions and create a life for themselves and impact their communities positively? This is the question that I ask myself. So the obvious answer is education. But even education does not suffice because even now, if a woman is not married in Zimbabwean culture, she is seen as having less status. One always has to be attached to a powerful man to legitimate yourself in Zimbabwe. And this goes on even now, even for women who are in politics and so forth. And maybe even especially in politics, because politics is very dangerous in my country. So people have to make sure that they are protected. So the whole idea of women achieving status is for me something that is still to happen, that women can achieve status in their own right. Um, we have a women's movement, but it is really concerned with grassroots issues. And this is where I am sometimes a little bit concerned myself with the development aid industry, because it is always looking downwards at the most needy of society and pouring resources downwards, which is good because we need that kind of activity. But if women are to achieve the kinds of goals that women like us set for ourselves, we also need to have input at higher levels. So that is really still a very open question in Zimbabwe at the moment.
And you also mentioned education as a tool for empowerment. And I'll share a personal experience. In fourth and fifth grade, let's just say not necessarily everyone liked me. And I was referred to with terms as whore and slut. These were some of the words which were referred to me, and I had no idea what they meant because I was in fourth and fifth grade, right? Those were the two grades. And I think education on what those terms really mean empowered me as well. So can you share your views on education as a tool for empowerment?
I think education can be a tool of empowerment, But I have been in several education systems myself. And from that experience, I think that the right education can be a tool for empowerment. In Rhodesia, we had a system of education that was called Bantu education. Bantu meaning people, so the people, the black people's education. And this was by law different from the kind of education that was given to the white people in Rhodesia. And basically, the idea of Bantu education came from the South African Prime Minister Verwoerd, who said that Black people were only fit to be drawers of water and hewers of wood. So, this education was basically to educate Black people well enough to do clerical tasks. So they could count what needed to be counted, they could make records of what needed to be recorded, but could not go any further. And so that kind of Bantu education obviously is a kind of education that puts a ceiling and it doesn't look at the power of the intellect, the power of imagination. And in fact, that is discouraged. The interesting story is that that was justified by saying that Black people did not have the intelligence to be educated beyond that basic level. So it just happened that the Rhodesian government opened a school for Black people, and my mother happened to be one of the women who went to this school. And in her O level year, she achieved the best O level results in the whole country, including the white schools. And so she actually pulled the rug out from beneath the government's feet. They could no longer claim that Black people were not sufficiently intelligent. And so my mother's performance actually started a debate about the capacity, the intellectual capacity of Black people, and that led to change.
That's incredible. And congratulations to your mother. And really talking about Tambu also aspires to get that honor roll, right? Honor roll in the Book of Not. She aspires to get that honor roll. And that was, and moving on really from that, you dive deeply into the complexity of maternal relationships and the difficulty of knowing how to feel towards one's mother because she's growing up with one family, she's with other people all the time for school. So how do you navigate the contradictions in relationships in real life and in your books?
Okay, the honor roll, that's really important. You know, we've just been talking about different kinds of education. And so for me, the honor roll really symbolizes a kind of education that is imposed from outside. And you are told you have to know this. And if you can repeat this well or do this task well, we will honor you. So this is the situation that Tambuzai found herself in, where she was being educated in a way that took her completely away from her roots, and she was to be rewarded for this. And she did not understand what was going on. So she actually worked hard to obtain this reward. And I see that today with young people. There is this idea that there is a youth dividend for the rest of the world in Africa. Nobody talks about the youth dividend in Africa for Africa. It's always people from the global north talking about the youth dividend that they hope to reap in Africa. And the African youth buy into this. I can't blame them because what do I have to offer them? But here are people who can actually offer life changing opportunities. And they're saying, come along, you young African people. We're going to make you into leaders. Of course, people are going to go. But in that process, they are being removed from where they come from. So, this whole idea with the honor roll was pointing to that process. When you are removed from where you come from, you are obviously going to have problems with relationships in that area where you came from. And this is typified in Nervous Conditions and the Book of Not, and in fact, also in This Mournable Body, by Tambudzai's relationship with her mother. That relationship begins to go sour when Tambudzai is very young and says she wants to go to school, her mother has only enough money to send Tambudzai's brother to school. So Tambudzai starts working to get her own school fees. And it is at that point that the relationship begins to go sour. I like to look at this from Tambudzai's mother's point of view. Here's your child saying, I don't want to be like you. I want to be better than you. You have failed to enable me to be better than you, so I'm going to do it for myself. Uh, I think that would upset any mother. Okay, I think one would not have to be as toxic about it as Sambudzai's mother was, but I can understand why that would be a really difficult experience for a mother to manage. And so the whole trilogy, because it is a trilogy, really is telling the story about how Tambudzai begins to understand her mother's point of view. And this finally happens at the end of this mournable body. And then again, there is the issue that if you are rejecting the person out of whose body you came, what does that mean for you and your acceptance of yourself? So these are some of the complicated issues that I was dealing with in the trilogy.
I will take a different point of view. I take it from Tambuzai. I think she's almost trying to say that all you try to do is impress, imprint, and ignore, right? She tried to impress uh, the husband or the man, trying to say that, oh, I'm sure she'll be a good wife, or whatever that role that the family wants her to play, the child will play. And then the mother imprints in her child mind that almost your father is the reason for your success, almost, right? And and even if the child does not become a success, right, uh, I know that this will happen. I observed my own grandmother and my great grandmother. I'm very sure they will do it. They will go to hibernation. They will ignore all of the stuff that is going around, right? And I think that is what a lot of women do, a lot of mothers do. And you're a political writer, and your work often discusses the impact of colonization. You mention it's bad enough when a country gets colonized, but when the people do as well, that's the end. That's the end. So, how do you think colonization continues to affect the identities and cultures of colonized nations today?
That's a really important question, Ayati. Just before I respond to that, though, I just like to go back to what you said, taking the story in nervous conditions that develops through to the Book of Not from Tambudzai's point of view. Absolutely. That's why she is the narrator. But I am just mentioning her mother's point of view to show the tensions and the anxieties that emanate from that situation. So, yes, colonization and what is happening now with respect to colonization. This is something I've been really concerned with because the question that I have had in mind is how have African countries that achieved independence from former colonizers become the kind of country they are, which is generally not the most successful? And I've been trying to think of a model that explains this to myself. And very recently, like in the last year or so, I came up with this idea of internal colonization. When I look at Southern Africa, we have 5 countries that had prolonged liberation armed struggles. And in these armed struggles, it meant that at least 2 generations of people would leave the country and live outside the country, train, and come back into the country as combatants. We're talking 15 years in the case of Zimbabwe, we're talking longer in the case of some of the other countries. So I then began to think about what are the characteristics of colonization. And one of the main characteristics of colonization is that a group of people from elsewhere with a different culture come in and impose themselves on a particular group of people in a particular area. And I began to think about the people who returned from exile that lasted 15, 20, 30 years. And I began to think to myself, can we really say that these people who returned still have the same culture and experience and perspective on life as the people who remained in the country? And obviously they don't, because they have been living a completely different life. And so I realized that at independence, many of us made the mistake and we thought that the people who were coming back, who were telling us that they had liberated us, were the people who left. But they were no longer the people who left, they were different people. And so when we see them imposing systems that do not benefit the people who are left behind, we should understand that because they're completely different people. They have different objectives. And so I call this internal colonization, where the people originated inside the country, went outside the country, and then returned to impose a different system on them. So I think we are still in a species of colonization now. And this is what I think we have to deal with. It is not the colonization from outside, but it is the colonization from inside.
You say that so powerfully, I think, and you have been a vocal activist and for social change and political change in Zimbabwe. So how do you see the intersection of your work as a writer, a filmmaker with your activism? And finally, do you believe art can drive political and social change?
I'll start with the last one. I don't really think that art can drive political and social change as such. What I think art can do is that it can impact individuals. And I think that is really important. And so for me, my work consists of trying to increase the amount of art that is made, the kind of art that speaks to people about what they could be, not necessarily what they are now, but what they could be, the kind of art that encourages people to dream. And I want to have as many people as possible in Zimbabwe and on the African continent engaging in such art and producing it. Because I think once you get people starting to dream about what they could be, they start asking the right questions. How can I be this? And once they start asking those questions, it is more difficult to control them with other people's agendas. And so that is where it becomes a political effect. But I do not believe that I, as a writer, can presume to say that I will have a political effect. My effect must be on the individuals. And they will be the people who will cause the political change in due course. That's how I look at it.
And I see that was the last question on this conversation, but I see the audience is very tuned in. So I have some rapid fire questions for you. Do you have a literary confession, like a classic book you've never read, or a cliche you say you've never read but you secretly love?
Uh, there's so many books that I should have read. So I'll just tell you about the latest, and it is Jeremiah's play The Hyenas. It was made into a film by Diop, a Senegalese filmmaker. And I always say to myself, you know, as somebody who came from literature, I should at least know the piece of literature that the film was based on, but I haven't. And so, okay, now you're making me feel guilty. I'll have to go and look for it.
And what's the strangest place you've ever found yourself writing or brainstorming?
Uh, I write anywhere. So for me, no place is strange. I think the people who look at me might think, why is that woman doing that here? But when I feel that I have to put something down, I just do it because I don't want to wait for an hour and get home. And by which time it's gone because I've been buying my ticket or I've been doing my shopping. So that flash of inspiration is gone. So for me, there are no strange places. How about you?
Bathroom.
Oh, the bathroom. Ah, okay.
The bathroom.
Uh, right.
Do you have any quirky writing rituals that your friends or family find amusing?
Okay, I don't know whether it's really a ritual, but what happens often is that I think about what I'm writing, and if something comes to me really powerfully, I'll say something like, okay, they found moot in the volcano, and I'll be sitting with my family. And they'll kind of look at me, and think, what are you talking about? Then I have to explain, sorry, it's just this one character. So that happens quite often.
And finally, what's your equality moonshot?
It goes back to what we were talking about increasing people's agency through art. So I really want to empower people, and particularly women, because I feel that women have been disempowered. So that's really what it's all about for me.
Thank you, Ms. Darabanga, for joining us today. It was a pleasure and an honor. You guys have been such a great audience. Don't forget to tag World Women Fund on all of your socials. Use the hashtag Equality Moonshot. And don't forget to give a big round of applause to Ms. Darabanga. And we'll shortly be going into a break.